From the cloisters of calm reflection to the front lines of brutal conflict, medieval nuns faced unexpected horrors during the chaotic centuries between the 10th and 15th. What happened when the walls meant to protect them crumbled? What truly threatened these women dedicated to God when armies marched through their peaceful lands? Get ready to explore the chilling realities of medieval wartime through the eyes of those you might least expect: the nuns. Number 1. Physical harm and violence. Cloister walls, intended to be a sanctuary, often proved porous when confronted by the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Nuns dedicated to a life of peace and prayer suddenly found themselves staring down the grim barrels of violence that engulfed the world outside their gates. When armies marched, whether they were conquering forces, raiding parties, or even their own kingdom's soldiers on the move, the distinctions between combatants and non-combatants often blurred into non-existence. Monasteries, with their stores of food, their often strategic locations, and their perceived wealth, were never truly immune from the direct physical threats posed by armed men. The gravest danger was often the immediate and direct physical assault. While the sanctity of religious figures was theoretically recognized, the heat of battle, the desperation of hungry soldiers, or the sheer lawlessness that accompanied troop movements could quickly override such ideals. Nuns, like other unarmed civilians, became targets for robbery, abduction, and the unthinkable. Stories, often hushed and passed down through fearful whispers, tell of soldiers breaking into monastic enclosures. These intruders, often driven by a combination of greed, lust, and the savage brutality war engenders, did not always respect the sacred vows or the spiritual devotion of the women they encountered. There are chilling, albeit sometimes fragmented, accounts from various chronicles that hint at these dark realities. For example, during the devastations of the 100 Years' War, particularly in parts of France and England, monastic communities frequently found themselves in the direct path of advancing armies. The Benedictine nunnery at La Charité-sur-Loire, like many religious houses, experienced the terror of siege and occupation, though specific details of violence against the nuns are often omitted from official records. A veil of euphemism often covered such atrocities. Contemporary historians and letter writers occasionally alluded to the dishonor and outrages committed, terms often used to imply sexual violence, an unspeakable horror for women who had taken vows of chastity. Another devastating example can be drawn from the context of the Hussite Wars in Bohemia during the 15th century. These religious wars were particularly brutal, with little quarter given. Catholic monasteries, including convents, were often targeted by Hussite forces, and vice versa. The city of Kutna-Hora, a rich silver mining town, saw intense fighting. While specific nunneries are not always singled out in detailed accounts, the general chronicles of the era speak of widespread destruction and violence against all inhabitants, including religious persons, when towns or monasteries were taken by storm. For the nuns caught in such conflicts, the danger was not just the loss of their home, but the threat to their very lives and their personhood. The reality was that a nun's habit, while offering some protection in times of peace, could become a symbol of defiance or a target for those who sought to desecrate holy spaces and mock religious devotion. Reports from the sack of various towns often included descriptions of clergy, both male and female, being subjected to torture to reveal hidden valuables, or simply being killed as a demonstration of power or out of sheer malice. The chronicler, Thomas Basin, writing about the conflicts in Normandy during the 100 Years' War, described the widespread lawlessness where soldiers often behaved like devils, plundering, burning, and committing every evil, a phrase that encompassed a wide range of horrific acts against the populace. Even in periods less characterized by full-scale invasion, localized skirmishes, banditry, and the breakdown of civil authority could place nuns in peril. A monastery situated near a major road or a disputed border could find itself repeatedly threatened by small bands of renegade soldiers or common criminals capitalizing on the chaos of war. These groups were often less disciplined than formal armies and more prone to indiscriminate violence. The danger of being captured for ransom, or worse, becoming a pawn in a larger conflict, was also very real. The physical threat also extended to the danger of forced labor or abduction. While not as commonly documented for nuns as for other women, there are instances where individuals from religious houses were seized to perform services for an occupying force or to be held for ransom. The dignity and independence of monastic life could be shattered in an instant by such an act, leaving the nuns at the mercy of their captors, vulnerable to further abuses far from the familiar routines and spiritual solace of their cloisters. The very nature of their lives, set apart from the secular world, made their exposure to such brute force even more jarring and terrifying. Number 2. Destruction and desecration of monasteries. For medieval nuns, their monastery was not merely a building. It was the physical embodiment of their spiritual life, their community, and their vows. It was their home, their workplace, their sanctuary, and their sacred space. When war descended, this vital center of their existence often became a prime target for destruction and desecration, inflicting a profound trauma that went far beyond mere property damage. The very foundation of their world could be shattered, literally and figuratively. Monasteries were often wealthy institutions, owning vast lands, possessing valuable treasures like chalices, reliquaries, and illuminated manuscripts, and storing considerable provisions. This wealth made them attractive targets for armies, desperate for supplies or seeking plunder to pay their soldiers. A general or commander might order the destruction of a monastery, not just for its wealth, but for strategic reasons. A well-fortified abbey could be used by the enemy as a stronghold, a barracks, or a supply depot. Therefore, its destruction was a military necessity to deny the enemy its use. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, just outside Paris, suffered significantly during the 100 Years' War, enduring multiple attacks and partial destructions as armies battled for control of the region. The method of destruction varied. Some monasteries were simply plundered and left empty, their contents stolen, but their structures largely intact. Others, however, were deliberately set ablaze. Fire was a potent weapon in medieval warfare, swift and devastating. A wooden roof or a library full of parchments could become a raging inferno in moments. The site of their beloved home, the chapel where they had prayed daily, the dormitory where they slept, all consumed by flames, would have been an unimaginably horrific experience for the nuns. The 14th century chronicler Jean Froissart frequently documented the burning of towns, villages, and monasteries as a common tactic in the Anglo-French conflicts, often describing the smoke rising for miles across the devastated landscape. Beyond physical destruction, there was the profound spiritual violation, desecration. This was perhaps even more traumatic for the nuns than the loss of the physical structure itself. Desecration meant the defiling of sacred spaces and objects. Churches might be used as stables for horses, their altars overturned, their holy vessels smashed or stolen, their religious images defaced. The very ground where the nuns knelt to pray, where the Eucharist was celebrated, where the relics of saints were venerated, could be profaned by the presence of unholy acts, violence, and general disregard for the sacred. The psychological impact of seeing their most holy objects treated with contempt, or their consecrated altars turned into dining tables by crude soldiers, would have been immense. The destruction of the monastic library was another significant loss. Monasteries were centers of learning and scholarship, preserving ancient texts, creating new ones, and serving as vital repositories of knowledge. The burning of a library meant the irretrievable loss of centuries of collected wisdom, prayers, histories, and illuminated art. For the nuns, who often dedicated parts of their lives to copying manuscripts or engaging in scholarly pursuits, this represented not just a material loss, but the obliteration of their intellectual and spiritual heritage. The loss of a single rare manuscript could be felt for generations, a tangible piece of their history, literally turned to ash. The impact of such destruction was long-lasting. Even if the nuns survived the initial assault, they were left without shelter, without their sacred objects, and often without the means to rebuild. The immediate spiritual devastation could lead to profound despair. How could they continue their dedicated life of prayer and service when their very spiritual home had been laid waste? Some communities dispersed, never to reform. Others, through immense perseverance and external aid, might eventually rebuild, but the scars of the destruction and desecration would remain, etched into the collective memory of the sisterhood. The rebuilding process itself could take decades, draining resources and energy, forcing the nuns to focus on physical survival rather than their spiritual pursuits. This transformation from spiritual custodians to building supervisors was a profound shift caused solely by the ravages of war. Number 3. Forced exile and displacement. When armies swept through the landscape rain fire and sword, one of the most immediate and terrifying dangers for medieval nuns was the prospect of forced exile and displacement. The cloister, which was meant to be a permanent, stable home, could suddenly become a place they had to abandon, turning these women of prayer into refugees with uncertain futures. This was not a choice. It was a desperate necessity driven by the advancing tide of conflict. Imagine a sudden alarm, riders on the horizon, reports of an army approaching fast, known for its brutality. The decision to flee would have been agonizing. Nuns had taken vows of stability, pledging to remain in their specific monastery for life. To leave meant breaking that vow, a profound spiritual crisis in itself, yet remaining often meant facing unimaginable horrors. With little time, the prioress or abbess would have to make the impossible call: stay and potentially face physical violence, desecration, and death, or abandon their spiritual home, their community, and everything they knew. When the decision to flee was made, it was a chaotic and terrifying undertaking. Nuns, often accustomed to a secluded and ordered life, were ill-equipped for travel. They would have to gather what few essentials they could carry. Perhaps a prayer book, a small reliquary, a few pieces of clothing. They left behind not only their buildings, but also their carefully tended gardens, their livestock, their fields, and the accumulated material wealth that sustained their community. The familiar routines of their lives, the hours of prayer, the communal meals, the work in the scriptorium or infirmary were instantly shattered. The journey itself was fraught with peril. Roads were often unsafe, filled with soldiers, bandits, and other refugees. Nuns, unaccustomed to exposure and physical hardship, would have faced hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Their distinctive habits, which offered some protection in times of peace, could now make them conspicuous targets for those seeking plunder, or worse. They traveled without the protection of armed escorts, relying on divine providence and the kindness of strangers. Accounts from the late 14th century, during the 100 Years' War, record numerous instances of communities, both lay and religious, being forced to abandon their homes in war-torn regions like Picardy and Normandy, seeking refuge in safer towns or more fortified monasteries. Finding refuge was another immense challenge. Some nuns might have sought shelter in other more secure monasteries of their order, if such existed and were not already overcrowded. But even then, they would be strangers, dependent on the charity of others, often straining the resources of their hosts. The Benedictine Abbey of Fontfroid, a double monastery for both monks and nuns, often served as a place of refuge for other religious from war-torn areas, but its capacity was not limitless, and even it faced dangers. Other nuns might have been forced to seek shelter with family members in secular society, a jarring return to the world they had forsaken, and a potential source of scandal or hardship for their relatives. Still, others might have found themselves completely destitute, relying on public charity, a profound humiliation for women who had previously lived lives of quiet dignity and self-sufficiency. The psychological toll of displacement was immense. Nuns had deliberately chosen a life of stability and spiritual focus. To be uprooted, to lose their community, their daily rhythm of prayer, and the physical manifestation of their vows was a profound trauma. They lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing if they could return or if their monastery would still be standing. The sense of homelessness, loss, and profound disruption to their spiritual vocation was a heavy burden, often leading to deep despair. The monastic rule was designed for a fixed location. Trying to maintain it while on the move or while dependent on others was nearly impossible. The spiritual core of their lives was shaken. Even if they eventually returned, the landscape might be devastated, their monastery a ruin, and their community fractured. The rebuilding process was arduous, and some communities never fully recovered their former strength or spiritual vibrancy. The experience of forced exile left an indelible mark, a constant reminder of the fragility of their peaceful existence in a world prone to violence. It was a stark lesson that even those dedicated to God could not escape the brutal realities of human conflict. Number 4. Starvation and disease. Warfare in the medieval period was not just about battles and sieges. It was a catastrophic force that utterly disrupted civilian life, often leading to widespread famine and devastating outbreaks of disease. Nuns, despite their monastic vows and a relative self-sufficiency of some abbeys, were far from immune to these silent, deadly consequences of conflict. In fact, their very existence often made them particularly vulnerable to these twin scourges. Medieval agriculture was highly localized and vulnerable. Fields were often trampled, crops burned, and harvests stolen by foraging armies. Peasants, who supplied the monasteries with food or worked the monastic lands, might flee or be killed, leaving vital agricultural labor undone. Supply lines which monasteries relied on for goods they could not produce themselves were frequently cut by hostile forces or rendered impassable due to the chaos of war. This immediate disruption meant that even well-provisioned monasteries could quickly find their stores dwindling. Chronicles from various parts of Europe during the 100 Years' War often detail the widespread destruction of crops and livestock, leading directly to famine conditions in regions like Gascony and northern France. As food became scarce, prices soared, making it impossible for many, including monastic communities whose incomes might also be disrupted by the war, to purchase what little was available. Nuns, who adhered to specific dietary restrictions, often found their meager rations reduced further. A lack of proper nutrition weakened their immune systems, making them susceptible to whatever illness swept through the population. Chroniclers of the Annales Londinenses, writing about the early 14th century, vividly described the widespread famine that gripped England, exacerbated by ongoing conflicts leading to countless deaths among all social classes, including religious communities. Disease was an equally terrifying companion to war. Armies on the march often carried diseases with them, spreading infections across vast distances. Soldier camps were notoriously unsanitary, breeding grounds for epidemics like dysentery, typhus, and smallpox. When these armies passed through or occupied an area, the diseases they carried quickly spread to the local populace, including the isolated monastic communities. Nuns might fall ill from contaminated water sources, or from direct contact with infected soldiers, or refugees seeking shelter within the monastery walls. The close quarters of monastic life while fostering community also meant that once a disease entered the cloister, it could spread rapidly through the entire sisterhood. The situation was compounded by the fact that war often led to a breakdown in public health measures, however rudimentary they might have been. Access to clean water was difficult, sanitation systems were overwhelmed or destroyed, and medical supplies were scarce. Monastic infirmaries, typically equipped for routine ailments, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick, both from within their own community and from the desperate local population who might seek their aid. Nuns, whose charitable work often included tending to the sick, put themselves at even greater risk of infection. Plague, for instance, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, devastating populations, was exacerbated by the weakened state of communities due to ongoing conflicts and famine. While not directly a product of war, its spread and severity were amplified by the disruptions war caused. Historical records, such as the obituary rolls of various nunneries, sometimes hint at periods of unusually high mortality among the sisters, often coinciding with known periods of warfare and associated famine or disease. While rarely explicitly stating, "died of starvation due to war," the circumstantial evidence is compelling. A community that suddenly loses a significant portion of its members within a short period, during a time of documented widespread hardship, strongly suggests the impact of these silent killers. For the surviving nuns, the loss of so many sisters, friends, and spiritual companions to disease or starvation would have been profoundly demoralizing, breaking the very fabric of their community and leaving them emotionally and physically depleted. The ongoing threat of famine and plague meant that even if they survived the initial onslaught of war, they lived under the constant shadow of these unseen, relentless enemies. Number 5. Pillage and theft of resources. Medieval monasteries, especially nunneries, often possessed significant wealth, not necessarily in liquid coin, but in land, agricultural produce, livestock, and most importantly, valuable liturgical objects and furnishing. This wealth, intended for the support of the community, the poor, and the glory of God, unfortunately made them irresistible targets for armies on the march. Pillage and theft of these resources represented a profound blow to the nuns, affecting their ability to sustain themselves, their spiritual practice, and their dignity. When an army approached, whether it was a hostile invading force or even their own king's troops requisitioning supplies, the first demand was often for food. Monasteries typically maintained large granaries and storehouses filled with grain, cheese, salted meats, and other provisions to feed the community throughout the year, as well as to distribute to the poor. Soldiers, often poorly paid and perpetually hungry, saw these stores as an immediate solution to their needs. They would simply take what they wanted, often without payment or consideration for the nuns' future sustenance. The prioress might protest, citing the monastery's vows of charity or their specific monastic rule, but such appeals often fell on deaf ears. English chronicler Henry Knighton, writing in the 14th century, details how during various campaigns both French and English armies would strip the land bare, leaving behind starvation, and religious houses were no exception to this brutal foraging. Beyond basic provisions, monasteries were often repositories of immense artistic and material value. Churches and chapels contained chalices, patens, crosses, and reliquaries made of gold, silver, and precious stones. Vestments used for liturgical services were often made of richly embroidered silk and adorned with pearls. The altar itself might be decorated with precious metals. These items, accumulated over centuries through donations from pious nobles and devoted commoners, were not just symbols of wealth. They were sacred objects, integral to the nuns' worship and spiritual life. Their theft was not merely a material loss, but a deeply felt desecration. To see a beautiful chalice, used for the consecration of the Eucharist, melted down for its silver, or a saint's relic box emptied and discarded, was a profound spiritual violation that caused immense grief and despair. Libraries, too, were not safe. While not typically made of precious metals, illuminated manuscripts, books of hours, and ancient scrolls were invaluable for their intellectual and artistic worth. They represented centuries of learning, prayer, and devotion. While less commonly stolen for their raw material value, they could be taken for their novelty, or simply destroyed in the general destruction of a monastery. The burning of a monastery often meant the irrecoverable loss of its entire library, effectively erasing generations of intellectual and spiritual heritage. Livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses were also highly desirable for armies, providing immediate food and transport. Monasteries often maintained extensive herds to support their communities. These were often driven away en masse, leaving the nuns without milk, meat, wool, or draft animals to work their fields. This loss crippled their ability to farm their land and sustain themselves, setting them back for years, if not decades. The impact of such widespread theft and pillage went far beyond the immediate material loss. It meant a profound economic setback for the nunnery. Without their crops, livestock, and accumulated wealth, the nuns would struggle to feed themselves, repair their buildings, or provide for the poor. It could force them to incur debts, sell off remaining land, or even abandon their monastery if they could no longer support themselves. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many nunneries, emphasized self-sufficiency, but war could make this ideal impossible. Constant threat of being stripped bare meant a perpetual state of anxiety, disrupting the peaceful contemplation that was central to their vows. The very act of living a dedicated, secluded life was undermined when the secular world, in its most brutal form, constantly reached in to take what it desired. Number 6. Loss of protection and patronage. Medieval nunneries, despite their spiritual focus, were deeply embedded in the secular power structures of their time. They relied heavily on the protection and patronage of powerful noble families, local lords, and the broader church hierarchy. These patrons provided land endowments, legal defense, and physical security, forming a crucial buffer against the dangers of the world. However, when war erupted, this vital system of protection could shatter, leaving nunneries exposed and vulnerable. A noble family might be the founder of a particular nunnery, or a long-standing benefactor, providing consistent financial support, gifts of land, and military protection. This protection was not merely symbolic, it often meant that the Lord's soldiers would defend the monastery from bandits or rival factions, or that their influence would deter malicious attacks. For instance, the Abbey of Barking, a prominent Benedictine nunnery in England, benefited from centuries of royal patronage and noble support, which provided a degree of security and prosperity. But in wartime, these patrons themselves became targets. A noble family could be wiped out in battle, their lands confiscated, or their lineage extinguished. Their wealth could be depleted by the costs of war, making them unable to provide the accustomed financial aid. If a lord switched allegiance or was defeated, the nunnery under their protection might find itself in hostile territory, its patron now powerless or even an enemy. Chaos of a civil war, like the Wars of the Roses in England, fragmented traditional loyalties and created a fluid, dangerous environment where established lines of protection became meaningless. A nunnery might find itself suddenly without any powerful advocate, its lands vulnerable to seizure, and its sisters at the mercy of whoever controlled the immediate territory. The broader church hierarchy also offered a degree of protection. Bishops and archbishops could intervene on behalf of monasteries, appealing to secular rulers or even excommunicating those who harmed religious houses. However, the church itself was not immune to the disruptions of war. Papal schisms, anti-popes, and conflicts between secular rulers and the papacy could weaken the church's authority and ability to act. A bishop might be too preoccupied with his own safety or political maneuverings to effectively defend a distant nunnery. Furthermore, if a monastery lay in a contested zone, the authority of its ecclesiastical superior might not be recognized by the occupying power, rendering any spiritual protection null and void in practical terms. The loss of protection meant that the nunnery was now entirely exposed. Without a lord to defend its lands, its fields could be ravaged, its peasants driven away, and its property seized by opportunists. Without a powerful patron to appeal to, its petitions for relief from taxation or military requisition might go unheard. This created an immediate and existential threat to the nunnery's survival. Without its traditional income, it might struggle to feed its sisters, maintain its buildings, or even pay its own taxes. The very existence of the community, which had been assured by centuries of patronage, was suddenly cast into doubt. The psychological impact of this loss of patronage was profound. The nuns had lived their lives secure in the knowledge that they were part of a wider protective network. To find themselves suddenly cut off, isolated and powerless in the face of brutal external forces was terrifying. It meant a loss of security, a feeling of abandonment, and a profound shift from a life of quiet devotion to one of precarious survival. The sense of being adrift in a violent world, without their traditional anchors, added an immense burden of anxiety to their already challenging existence. Number 7. Psychological trauma and despair. While physical dangers, destruction, and material losses were devastating, the invisible wounds of psychological trauma and despair often proved to be the most insidious and long-lasting for medieval nuns caught in wartime. Their lives were meticulously ordered, centered on spiritual devotion, communal harmony, and quiet contemplation. War shattered this delicate balance, plunging them into a world of chaos, fear, and profound emotional distress. Constant threat of violence, whether direct or indirect, created an environment of pervasive fear. Nuns lived with the knowledge that their monastery could be attacked at any moment. Their lives and vows violated. Every distant drumbeat, every rumor of approaching soldiers, every plume of smoke on the horizon would have sent shivers of terror through the community. This sustained level of anxiety, day after day, week after week, eroded their peace of mind. It became difficult to focus on their prayers, their work, or their communal life when the specter of invasion loomed constantly. The ability to achieve spiritual calm, so central to their vocation, would have been severely compromised by the relentless apprehension. Witnessing atrocities was another source of profound trauma. Nuns might see their neighbors murdered, their villages burned, or their families displaced. If their monastery was directly attacked, they might witness the violent deaths of their sisters, the desecration of their sacred spaces, or the brutalization of local people who had sought refuge with them. Such events would leave indelible mental scars, vivid nightmares, and a deep sense of helplessness. The human mind struggles to process such horrors, and for women dedicated to a life of compassion and service, the brutal realities of war would have been particularly shocking and morally abhorrent. The 14th century account from the Chronicle of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, describing the ravages of the routiers, mercenary companies who plundered parts of France, speaks of the terror felt by all, including religious, highlight the extreme distress caused by the widespread violence. The loss of community and routine was also a significant source of despair. Monastic life was structured around a rigorous daily schedule of prayer work and communal meals, designed to provide stability and spiritual discipline. War often shattered this routine. Nuns might be forced to flee, dispersing the community. Those who remained might find their daily services disrupted by fear, lack of resources, or the presence of hostile soldiers. The quiet of the cloister, essential for contemplation, was replaced by noise, fear, and the constant threat of intrusion. The bonds of sisterhood, while strong, were strained by shared suffering and the grief of losing members to violence, disease, or flight. The disruption of their sacred daily office, the very rhythm of their spiritual lives, was not merely an inconvenience but a profound spiritual injury. How could they pray when their church was desecrated, or when their minds were consumed by terror? Guilt and moral distress were also possible. Some nuns might have felt guilt over their own survival when others perished, or over compromises they were forced to make for survival, such as hiding valuables or appearing to cooperate with invaders. The ethical dilemmas posed by wartime where lines between right and wrong became blurred, could lead to deep moral anguish. Question of whether they had done enough, whether they had betrayed their vows in some way, would torment their consciences. The overall sense of hopelessness could be overwhelming. Nuns had dedicated their lives to serving God and seeking salvation in a peaceful, ordered environment. War presented a world seemingly devoid of God's order, filled with unbridled evil and suffering. This could lead to a crisis of faith, or at least a profound spiritual struggle, as they grappled with the apparent triumph of chaos and human depravity. The future seemed bleak, their purpose undermined, and their efforts seemingly futile. This profound despair, though less visible than a physical wound, could be just as debilitating, leading to a lingering sense of brokenness that might never fully heal, even long after the wars had ended. Number 8. Forced requisition and extortion. Even when a nunnery managed to avoid direct physical destruction or outright pillage, it rarely escaped the economic burden of war. Armies, whether friendly or hostile, needed to be fed, housed, and supplied. Monasteries, often owning extensive lands and possessing considerable resources, became prime targets for forced requisition and outright extortion. This drained their wealth, disrupted their economy, and could leave them on the brink of ruin, even without a single battle fought on their doorstep. Forced requisition meant that military commanders would simply demand goods from the monastery. This could include vast quantities of grain, livestock, wine, timber, and even valuable metals or textiles. The demands were often presented as non-negotiable necessities of war, backed by the threat of violence if refused. The English crown, for example, frequently requisitioned supplies from monasteries during its campaigns in France and Scotland. While some nominal payment might be promised, it was often delayed, incomplete, or never materialized, effectively making it a seizure. A monastery might lose its entire year's harvest, leaving the nuns with no food for themselves or to support their charitable work for the poor. The 13th century records from the Benedictine Abbey of Shaftesbury, one of the wealthiest nunneries in England, show how royal demands for aid during various campaigns could significantly strain their resources, even without direct conflict at their gates. Extortion was a more direct form of financial pressure. This involved threats of destruction or violence, unless a specific sum of money or goods was paid. Rogue mercenary bands known as routiers during the 100 Years' War were particularly infamous for this tactic. They would besiege a town or monastery, demanding a protection fee or ransom to spare it from destruction. Nuns, having no military defense, were often compelled to pay these sums, sometimes by selling off valuable church plate, borrowing heavily, or imposing heavy levies on their tenants. These payments, while saving the monastery from immediate harm, crippled its finances for years to come. The Benedictine nunnery of Poissy in France, located near Paris, suffered immensely from such demands and requisitions throughout the various phases of the 100 Years' War, enduring heavy financial burdens to maintain its existence. Armies needed places to rest and shelter, and monasteries, with their large buildings and often secure walls, were ideal. Nuns would be forced to house, feed, and sometimes even care for soldiers for extended periods. This not only drained their food supplies and financial resources, but also disrupted their cloistered life. Presence of large numbers of armed men, often rowdy and undisciplined, within their sacred space was a profound violation of their peace and privacy. The strict rules of the cloister, designed to separate the nuns from the secular world, became impossible to enforce, forcing the sisters into unwelcome and potentially dangerous interactions with the soldiers. The long-term economic impact of these demands was devastating. Monasteries relied on a stable income from their lands and investments to maintain their buildings, support the sisters, and fund their charitable activities. Constant requisitions and extortion payments depleted their reserves, forced them into debt, and could lead to the selling of their land, their most fundamental asset. This not only reduced their future income, but also diminished their influence and ability to provide for themselves. A nunnery that had been wealthy and prosperous before a war could emerge from it, impoverished and struggling for mere survival. The very foundations of its economic independence, built over centuries, could be dismantled in a few years of relentless military demands. Furthermore, these financial demands often meant that the nuns could not carry out their charitable works, which were central to their mission. They might no longer be able to feed the poor, tend to the sick, or provide shelter to the needy when their own granaries were empty and their coffers bare. This undermined their spiritual purpose and their connection to the local community, creating a sense of failure and frustration among the sisters. Constant pressure of military demands transformed their focus from spiritual pursuits and charitable endeavors to the grim task of economic survival in a hostile and unforgiving world.